My name is Justin Victor, and I am the founder of Vibrational Instinct in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and a certified neuroacoustic sound therapist. I had a lot of interest in this presentation I did on April 27th, 2023, in person and following, and so the recording at that time wasn't ideal, so I'm doing this other one that's a little bit more brief and to the point and of a better quality to inform those about the efficacy of biotuning and neuroacoustics in general. So with that, I'm going to proceed forward with this presentation that I did that is very similar to the one that I did previously. So here's a quick outline about what I'll be covering and talking about, and it's just kind of an intro to the nervous system in general, as well as brainwave entrainment, and where biotuning, the modality that I'm practicing in neuroacoustics, comes in and its value. So as I mentioned, I am the founder of Vibrational Instinct, a holistic healing company in Canada, in Alberta, in Edmonton. And so I practice energy healing, reconnective healing. I'm a spiritual conduit, channeling spiritual entities. I do a lot of hands-on work with the meridians, practicing touch for health and Barry's body management. But the novelty mostly, and a lot of the work that I do, is in neuroacoustics and biotuning, which comes to this about being a professional stressler or someone that wrestled with stress for years. And I had at one point a very clear directed path as to what I wanted to experience and what I wanted to do for a vocation, but health pulled me in a different direction. And looking back, I can really recognize the degree to which stress, however you might interpret that for yourself, but an accumulation of experiences that didn't go fulfilled, had an impact on my life in bringing me to this new crossroads, being in holistic healing, which I'm more passionate for than ever. So here's a little bit about the nervous system. If you know a lot about it already, feel free to skip ahead. But if you don't, this will be a very brief introduction to it. Essentially, we bring in information from our environments through what we smell, see, hear, and taste. And then that is processed through the central nervous system with the peripheral nervous system to bring us to a proper response for the environment so that we can continue to move into the next experience and the next one and the next one with as little suffering and trauma as possible. Now, this doesn't actually happen in real time. There was a study talking about how what we perceive actually lags behind the event that we are perceiving by about 80 milliseconds, which is really interesting. So neurons or nerve cells are the basic unit of communication in the nervous system, and they can be incredibly small, but up to a meter in length. And essentially they receive information electrically from one end through dendrites, and then they send off information to the next neuron through the axons. And in that way, it's kind of like a long game of telephone. And that's going to be an analogy I'm going to use later on when talking about brainwaves. So the central nervous system is one component, which is the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is outside of the central. And the subset that I deal with biotuning and neuroacoustics is the autonomic nervous system, which is broken down into the sympathetic, or fight or flight, and parasympathetic, rest and digest responses. And those are both, as suggested, autonomic. We don't have conscious control over them, but they are impacting every single waking and sleeping moment of our lives. And so optimizing them, or at least making sure that they are working to the best of their abilities with what we have in our life experiences, is vital for having not only a disease-free life, but one that transcends conventional definitions of what health is. There's also the enteric nervous system, which is related to the bowels and digestion, and that's a whole another realm that I don't explicitly deal with, but it's still there, and it's worth mentioning. So the diagram you see on the left is kind of a little bit of a depiction about how these systems might work, with the sympathetic on the left and the parasympathetic on the right. And it's from Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky, which is a fantastic summary for a lot of the autonomic nervous system and the stress response, which, if you're interested in learning more, I'd highly encourage you to read. As I mentioned, the parasympathetic is the rest and digest, and the sympathetic is the fight or flight. The extent of each is vastly different, with the sympathetic innervating in nearly every single tissue. So if your hair stands on end in your body, when you have a stress or fear response, those are sympathetic nerve fibers innervating each of those single hair follicles. whereas the parasympathetic is limited to the external genitalia, head, viscera, or abdominal organs, and then the degree to which this communication is passed on through the systems is different. And I'm going to be showing you that in a moment. So there's this idea that there's an exclusive operation between the two, meaning that you're either in one or the other, and it's antagonistic. That's somewhat misleading, as these systems work synergistically in a lot of ways. And essentially, there are quite few, relatively speaking, tissues that are innervated or connected to both of these systems where they act in a seesaw manner in an antagonistic or opposite way. So there's a lot more going on than just one or the other. Now here's a quick review about what I just talked about with regard to the pathways. So you can see the sympathetic on the left coming out of the thoracic vertebrae, going through the sympathetic chain, of which there are paravertebral ganglia in there, or clusters of nerve cell bodies that act as way stations. There are also collateral ganglia, and those are going directly to the organs. There may be a few more ganglia along the way, but essentially it's more extensive than the parasympathetic on the right that is coming out of the cervical, cranial nerves, essentially, and then the sacral nerves down below to parasympathetic ganglia and to the organs. So in one way, you could almost say that the parasympathetic nervous system controls it. So when the parasympathetic turns on, the sympathetic turns off by default. This might be a little simplistic, but I just wanted to give a brief overview about what that kind of looks like. Now, everyone has stress. Stress is normal. I tell this to all my clients, and essentially, the sympathetic stress response was made for a sprint, not a marathon. So if you are chronically stressed, you are inhibiting your immunity, digestion, higher brain centers, and so on. And you can't have the maintenance that needs to happen to take place to actually get you from day to day without falling into a state of distress and eventually dis-ease. And so in that way, stress, I would say, actually amending this here from Robert Sapolsky, although it is a very nice summary of it, that chronic stress increases your risk of getting diseases that make you sick, or if you have such a disease, stress increases the risk, or chronic stress increases the risk of your defenses being overwhelmed by the disease, rather than just saying stress makes you sick. So by doing it this way, we can actually account for more of the individual differences and how people manifest disease, and then also come up with a more specific, useful, and comprehensive approach to working with every individual as they are individuals. Now, it's no secret that mental health issues and disorders are on the rise around the world, and the vast majority of doctor's office visits come from stress-related complaints. Now, part of that can be linked to epigenetics, as Bruce Lipton talks about, or control above the genes, whereas genes are blueprints, and essentially, we're not changing the genes themselves when we perceive certain experiences, but we are modifying the expression of those genes to either program us for a optimal health place or one that is suboptimal based upon, environmental influences. Could be toxins, nutrition, stress, and emotions, how we perceive our experiences. Not necessarily, but it could be talked about in a glass half full, half empty kind of thing. But essentially, if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So it's about your perceptions and then what it is that is impacting your genes' expressions, which is going to impact your physiology and, of course, your overall health. So here is something brief I wanted to talk about, just a little exercise. So essentially, it's a koan or a Zen paradoxical story that has been utilized to induce kind of a critical thinking that can bring one to a state of stress that can induce maybe an enlightening or enlightened stage of sorts. So I'm going to read this and then we're going to briefly talk about it. Kaigan said, Zen is like a man hanging in a tree by his teeth over a precipice. His hands grasp no branch, his feet rest on no limb, and under the tree another person asks him, why did Bodhidharma come to China from India? If the man in the tree does not answer, he fails, and if he does answer, he falls and loses his life. Now what shall he do? If you'd like to contemplate this longer, you can pause the video here and I'll go into a little bit more. I'm not going to give you the answer, even though I would rather fail than fall, but you can stop here for a moment if you'd like. So was it a distressful experience? Just that koan? If so, then why? Or If it wasn't, why not? Well, it was relatively brief. Like I mentioned, the stress response is designed for a sprint, not a marathon. So in this way, this is a really kind of brief exercise, if you will. So hopefully it wasn't too distressful. And it was probably manageable in some ways. You could break it down, take your time, relax into it, maybe come back to it. Maybe you're listening to this a couple days later or a week later or something like that, and you've arrived at some sort of an answer that makes sense to you on various levels. And there could be a potential return with that too. A sort of self-esteem boost or some kind of a new perspective on life that can bleed into other areas. It probably wasn't too distressful. And with the expectation that you had about it, that shapes your perception about it, which influences your genes or the expressions of your genes, epigenetics, as we were talking about. And then this leads into eustress, a positive form of stress that we can relate to things like exercise and maybe some cognitive exercises like this. Now, I talked about this before, but a chronic stress response does inhibit the immune system. It's interesting, though, that for a mild stress, and even one that's moderately prolonged, the immune system is actually boosted. And this can be discussed in other different faculties in the body as well. But, this makes it a little bit less apparent that the idea that stress causes disease is quite limiting, at least far from it. And then the complexity of that was talked about by Max Gerson in his Gerson Therapy book, talking about how there's a need for a collaborative effort and a holistic view, so to speak, of the body and how it maintains and how it knows how to grow itself into a huge body out of 2 cells. And there's a lot going on that we aren't aware of. And I don't feel like being aware of that would do us very much of a service, especially because we wouldn't be able to take all these tasks over from the body. We might live for all of a few seconds if we had to coordinate every single process going on in the body. Okay, so now we're going to get into a little bit about what brainwave entrainment is, and this is where a lot of my work lies. So binaural beats are, I'm going to break it down into 2 components. Binaural, meaning you need 2 ears to hear it, as opposed to a monaural beat, which you would hear both frequencies, same frequencies with both ears, like in shamanic drumming. And then the beat is actually a kind of a wah-wah sound in and out, as your brain is processing the different frequency that you're getting in each ear. So what is a brainwave? Well, essentially, it is a period of electrical activity across the brain. It goes from the bottom, the back of your brain, so essentially at the top of your cervical vertebrae, near the back of the brain, all the way up across the surface the whole time, from the back to the front, and then ending in the front of your brain, essentially where your forehead would be, just above there. And so that's across the brain, and it is a wave shape, so it's called a brain wave. It's actually electrical activity. Now, these are measured in hertz. What a hertz is it's just a cycle per second. So if you imagine yourself sitting in a boat on an ocean, and then a wave bumps up against your boat, the time it takes for the next wave to bump against your boat is the frequency. So if one wave hits your boat every second, that's 1 hertz. Now similarly, if the electrical activity that starts from the back that goes to the front of the brain does that in 1 second, that's 1 hertz. Now that we've described what that is, we can talk about the frequency following response. So binaural beats are created by having a different frequency in both of your 2 ears. So you're wearing headphones or earbuds. And essentially, you're not hearing either of those 2 frequencies. You're hearing halfway between. So if one of my ears is getting 2 hertz and the other is getting 1 hertz, I'm hearing 1.5 halfway between the 2. And then the brain wave is actually the difference. So going back to our example of 2 and 1 hertz, the difference between those 2 minus 1 is 1. The brain wave speed is 1 hertz, meaning that all of the electrical activity goes across the brain in 1 second. Now, you can look at it as a big game of telephone as well, if that's easier to understand. The electrical activity going, like I said, from the bottom of the back of the brain all the way to the front. It's like a long game of telephone that these neurons are completing, the nerve cells on the surface of the brain. Or you can look at it as a respiratory rate, so to speak, for the brain, which will be really relevant when we talk about the different brainwave states. So just as you would breathe differently if you were eating, sleeping, exercising, meditating, the brain has different respiration rates, so to speak, based upon what it's doing or what your whole body is in a state of. Could be sleep, meditation, creative work, but it's not a oxygen carbon dioxide exchange. It's just electrical activity, different speeds. When you hear a different frequency in each ear, it initiates kind of like a mini stress response in the brain, because nowhere in nature do you hear two different frequencies without wearing headphones or earbuds. You're hearing the same frequency, but the intensity is higher on one side, which just tells you which direction that sound is coming from. But because we have a different frequency in each ear in this way, the hemispheres kind of got to compare notes because they're not hearing what each side is hearing. And so they synchronize across the band of tissue, the corpus callosum between the left and right hemispheres, and you get a phantom pulsing sound or a beat. And so that is essentially how the binaural beats are created. And they fall in different ranges of delta, theta, alpha, and others, which I'll discuss. And there's also a relationship with octaves and harmonics, and I can get into that a little bit later. Here's where we're going into biotuning, and this is where we put all this together in a form that's therapeutically relevant and useful for you or whoever's interested in it. Now, a good introduction to this is in the documentary Heal. My instructor, Dr. Jeffrey Thompson, is in this documentary, and he plays a prominent role in the film and works with someone, and you can actually get a better idea about how this works. I'd highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in learning it from him directly. So how the setup looks like in office is someone is lying on a sound table, and essentially it's a massage table with speakers or transducers underneath, so you're getting an input from the vibration through the table. That's connected to an amplifier, that Yamaha receiver, and that's essentially converting that sound into a vibration that you can feel. Along with that receiver, the headphones that you're wearing, that you're hearing the frequencies from, are connected to this PreSonus unit, which is like an interface between the laptop providing the sound and vibrational input to the headphones and receiver, and that's going to the sound table. You're also going to have sensors on your wrists, so this is only collecting your heart rate from the wrist. There's no transmission of information. And essentially, the program, the biotuning program, utilizes your heart rate to calculate the heart rate variability, which is just as it sounds, the variation in your heart rate. Think of someone with a pacemaker. They don't have a very high variability because the heart rate is set by the device. So the heart rate variability is a gold standard in Western medicine. The more variability you have, the greater resilience, longevity, and general health that's more optimized. So it's better to have a higher variability. And that's connected to the laptop. So the laptop is utilizing that information to give me a readout in real time about what's going on in the system. And it looks like this. This is only a snapshot. So all of these windows are moving forward in a session. In this case here, it's one of my sessions. And the heart rate is coming in that top middle window there. The green band is a statistical normal average heart rate, so I can see how someone's heart rate is compared to where maybe they should be. And like I said, that's converted to the heart rate variability, and that information is utilized by the biotuning program to give me, on the top left window, the fight or flight blue response and the rest and digest green response there. And those are connected. The heart rate variability and the autonomic nervous system are connected through different frequency bands and mathematical algorithms. So by monitoring the heart rate as I can see in real time someone's stress response. And I can see how they respond to the sounds and vibrations that they're getting through the headphones and the table, respectively. The bottom left window is another way of showing what's going on in the top left, with the blue and green also showing stress and relaxation, respectively. The red is related to blood pressure in the neck, hormonal influences on the stress response, and oftentimes subconscious ruminations and thinking. If people are going through a lot of subconscious activity and they're actually stuck in a stress response, I'd like to leave them to that, so that whatever it is that they're working on in the back office of the subconscious, it can get worked on without being pulled out of them by a therapist and potentially re-traumatizing them. I'm not a psychologist, and I don't have to talk to people like that in this setting because I'm letting the body go through that on its own. The bottom right window is just showing essentially each slice of what's happening in the bottom left. So every time that bottom left changes, the bottom right has a new one put in there. It's just showing me in a waterfall display is what it's called, those slices of information. The top right window is showing me the energy in the autonomic nervous system. So energy meaning the capacity to do work, essentially. You have more energy available to you if you are having a good diet and you're actually digesting those foods and you're getting a lot out of your sleep. So the consequence of having more energy, or rather the significance in this case, is that when someone finally does get to a zero stress point, which I'm going to show you, then they actually have energy available in their body that can be utilized for healing. So back to the top left window. Like I said, the blue is the fight or flight and the green is rest and digest. All of your healing that actually needs to take place happens in between the two. So you can see where the blue comes down to a minimum until it goes to zero, and the green on the other side. Any one of those crossovers in that top left window shows that zero stress point. And so if you have a glass full of water and that's your whole energy you have available to you, if you're having a stress response, that's going to kicking at your blood pressure and your heart rate to pump out blood to your extremities to have a stress response for a potentially life or death threatening situation. Or on the contrast, if it's going to the rest and digest, you are excreting wastes and digesting foods. But in between the two is where healing actually happens, because the water in that glass, your energy you have available, is sitting in the body. It's not being utilized in any of those two reservoirs, so it's sitting in the body, and the body doesn't just do nothing, it uses that energy for healing. So that's detoxing, tissue repair, and maintenance list stuff. Because people, when they come in, they often have a grocery list of things they want worked on. But what their number one is might be number 8 on the body's list, because it knows how to heal. It knows how to grow a body out of 2 cells. And so essentially, when we bring the body back to that zero stress point, it can start to work on these things. And, it takes some time to unravel an abnormal stress response. Typically, people are stuck in the blue sympathetic, but they can be stuck in the green parasympathetic, which is related to severe PTSD and chronic fatigue syndrome. But it doesn't have to take as long as it took you to get there. But I encourage people to have patience when I do these tracks for them and I come in for their sessions, because it does take some time. So if you take away anything from this presentation, it should be this: that in between this fight or flight and rest and digest is where you have to be to support healing. Physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, whatever it is. Otherwise, your energy is getting sourced into either of those two systems, which are useful, but you're not going to be optimizing healing in those areas. We're going through the phases of biotuning now. So phase 1 healing is where everyone starts. Now, the binaural beat, like I mentioned, is the pulsing sound that you get when you're listening to 2 different frequencies, one in each ear. This is what's creating the brainwave state. So delta, I'll just explain this briefly, and then all the other ones, I'll just mention the values. Delta is 0.5 to 3.5 hertz difference, or that's the binaural beat. That essentially means that the difference between what the left and right ears are hearing, the different frequencies, the difference between those two is anywhere from 0.5 to 3.5 hertz. That's it. That's the brainwave speed, and that's just the difference between what both ears are hearing. Delta is all of our physical healing and deep sleep. And delta is broken down into 3 sessions based upon what the body prioritizes, and it's mathematically calculated out to be that way. Furthermore, the physical stress handling system in delta handles not only physical, but mental, emotional, and self-defeating belief systems. I don't want people going into emotional work or working with self-defeating belief systems if the physical stress handling system can't process what that healing looks like. So it does take a little bit of time, but like I said, if you're consistently listening to your tracks that I give you at the end of each of your sessions, then it can unfold flowingly, normally, and optimally. Theta is where all emotional healing happens. Alpha is for the mental healing, and like I said, clearing self-defeating belief systems. Default mode network is 2 sessions, and I'll get back to that later. And gamma is for a master reset for the brain, and it binds things together. If you drop something, you can generally, if you have gamma brainwave activity, put the sight of that and the sound of that together, and you say, oh, that's where that sound came from. You can combine these, and so the world makes sense. In severe autism, for example, if there's a deficiency of gamma brainwave activity, then all of your different senses are no longer working together. They're not bound together, so you can't make sense out of your environment. It's chaotic. Now, for these and all of the different brainwave states, they triple in function. Not double, but triple. Going back to theta, there is a healing function, emotional healing with dreaming. There's an everyday function in creativity, and there's a meditative function for shamanic journeying and certain Christian prayer states. Every single track has that, and it's based upon your intention and how you position your body. So for example, when people are just starting out, I encourage them to listen to their delta track while they're lying down as if they could fall asleep, because the body associates that position with this brainwave state for physical healing and going into a deep state of sleep where healing takes place. So delta, like I said, 0.5 to 3.5 hertz. For the binaural beat, theta is 3.5 to 7, alpha 7 to 13, gamma 13, all the way up to hyper gamma and 100 hertz. And default mode network goes down. It's actually below delta. It's a little less than 0.15 hertz, essentially. It's associated with our whole sense of self. So it's introspective, it's our sense of self in time and space, and it's holographic, non-focused mind wandering. Essentially, if you're engaged in an external activity, the default mode network activity comes down. Think of losing yourself in your work. Since default mode network, these 4 regions are associated with our sense of self. If you are working on something external, you're working, the default mode network activity comes down, your sense of self and your awareness of that comes down as well. So that's where that comes in. And as you can imagine, if that's your whole sense of self, it's 95% of our brain activity, after all, in this place. Any kind of a desynchronizing of that can be the source of all manner of dissociative psychiatric disorders. And I can't say that I'm curing anything. I can only say that I'm modulating the autonomic nervous system. But as we're going to see in a moment, the default mode network is associated with all sorts of these different disease states that allopathic medicine works with in different ways on their own. And then on the flip side, a very high state of meditation can be reached with a hypersynchronized default mode network. So here we are with some basic research. Default mode network has been linked to depression, schizophrenia, epilepsy. There's actually a concussion component too as well. There's dementia, Alzheimer's. If you have any kind of a head, body, or full body injury, the concussive force of that desynchronizes the default mode network. And as far as I'm aware, there's no other therapy out there that can resynchronize them for you. And that's why it's really exciting. All the research going into default mode network and sound and vibration in general. There's a special phase related to specific conditions, but like I said, all of these tracks can triple in function for you for everyday healing and meditative functions. SMR beta, or sensory motor rhythm beta. Beta is a focus state. This gets you to a calm hyperfocus. It integrates motor information and helps with the ability to relax and improving your balance, motor precision. Mu is specifically implicated in things like echolalia and autism spectrum disorder. It's all of our socializing skills, how we learn from watching people talk with their expressions, their tones of voice, and socializing activity, essentially, related to the mirror neuron function, which you might have heard of, the monkey see, monkey do. Elemental oxygen is actually a specific sound, comes from the periodic table. Elemental oxygen was converted to a sound, and it sounds just like a heartbeat, and it's used for things like COPD and asthma, or I'd put those in there, this elemental oxygen track, to help with improving airflow and circulation. And then elemental gold from the periodic table as well. It actually brings down the activity of the immune system. And why would you want this? Well, if you have a certain virus in the body, say you have AIDS, and the immune system has been hijacked by the virus and is now spewing more of the virus out into the body, we'd like to bring down the activity of the immune system, or even for an autoimmune condition, which is multifaceted and it's not as simple as just a brainwave state generally. And then while that's going on, we can boost the energy of the body to the roof while we're giving the immune system some relief. From the special phase, SMR beta is within the 13 to 30 hertz range of beta. Mu is within alpha, approximately 9 to 11 hertz, and then elemental oxygen and gold don't have specifically defined frequencies. So phase 2 enhancement, this is when one's no longer broken, so to speak. We can optimize different functions. Epsilon's more of a metaphysical state, we'll get back to that, and we can connect that to the physical symptoms in delta. Theta delta, emotional and physical together, so we can find out about the emotional traumas expressing as physical symptoms, but it also works to help with learning, long-term memory, and studying. Alpha theta is where people usually recognize the Schumann resonance to be, about 7.83 hertz. Your alpha theta frequency will be different based upon what your zero stress frequency is, which we'll talk about later. So that's another way to tune into the planet. Beta alpha gives you the focused beta and peripheral alpha activity, which is where a lot of high IQ prodigy children have brainwave activity, so we can boost IQ and brain processing power. And while gamma gives us a more universal perspective on things, we have the beta in there as well for a focus, so we get a different perspective from a universal standpoint. And then phase 3 expansion. So epsilon is just below sleep, about 0.125 to 0 0.5 hertz, and it's all metaphysical stuff. It's related to out-of-body experiences, precognitive or predictive experiencing, insight spiritually, and a different angle from which to view the identity of your dis-ease. Iota is more experimental, and it's the slowest brainwave state that I have in my repertoire at the moment, 0.01 hertz. Think of that, 1% of your brain has lit up electrically every second. It's on the level of plant respiration and tree respiration. We can align with nature and more fully appreciate and organize ourselves with the heart of the source of life itself, with plants that allow for feeding by herbivores and then carnivores, and we're all part of that hierarchy. Hypergamma and lambda are the other side of the spectrum from iota. Hypergamma, about 100 hertz or a bit more. Lambda is over 200 hertz. So if I were to say 200 hertz binaural beat for lambda, that means that electrical activity across the brain happens 200 times per second. So it's a very high brainwave state. And both these and iota are experimental. So essentially, they haven't been really researched or anything like that. I utilize experimental frequencies for people that want that. And so we can use this to potentially tap into external energy sources. So there have been measurements of high amplitude gamma brainwave activity. Each brainwave state has the same amount of energy going into it. So if you have less peaks and troughs in a given amount of time, such as something like delta, you can expect the peaks and troughs to be higher. But if there are more of those peaks and troughs, the frequency is higher, like gamma, hypergamma, and lambda. The peaks and troughs, the amplitude, the height, and the depth should be lower. But if you have energy pulling in from your environment, such as monks meditating in mountains, pulling energy in from around them, melting snow, then you can have high amplitude, hypergamma, high gamma, and lambda brainwave states. So as you can see at this point where we're now getting into really high meditative states. Vibration sense network is something we work with through the sound table. So it's separate from hearing. It's actually between 0.3 and 500 hertz, whereas conventional hearing is 20 to 20,000 hertz, which is why we work with an overlap of 20 to 500 through the sound table and headphones. Now you might think, the delta brainwave state, it's 0.5. That's below the 20 to 500. You're not hearing the delta of 0.5. That's what the brainwave speed is, and you're getting two frequencies in each ear where the difference is 0.5. So we could have 100 and 100.5 hertz, one on each side, and that will give you the 0.5. And so, as I mentioned before about the brainwave amplitude and the energy, as you can see when we go up to beta up top there, the up and down, the peak and the trough, are quite a bit smaller than when we go down to delta, but more of them are happening over the same period of time, whereas with delta, there's less of them. So that's what I was talking about having high amplitude gamma activity. And if it were normal gamma activity, the peaks and troughs would be even smaller than that beta you'd see up there. So this is what it looks like. This is just a brief snapshot from a biotuning track. So when someone comes in, they are lying on the table for about 3 minutes before the table starts to vibrate. At 4 minutes, my charts will pop up. So they're getting the audio and vibrational input at 3 minutes in. And essentially, I'm looking at everything that I talked about in that screenshot, showing all the stress response, heart rate, energy levels. I can see all that moving forward in real time. And while that input is coming through the headphones and table, I'm watching to see how their body's responding. I'm looking in that top left window at the stress response. Essentially, the frequency coming through the headphones and table is just going up and down, back and forth, up and down, 50 to 200 hertz, and back down. And I'm waiting to see when they get to the zero stress point. And that point, when they do get there, the frequency that they're experiencing is the zero stress frequency. It's the frequency that brings them to the place where any and all healing happens. So that's what you're seeing in that top line there, the 138.14. That's the zero stress frequency that was found for me. And essentially, they're not only getting the zero stress frequency in their track, they're getting several octaves below, maybe even some above, depending on what the frequency is. But as you can see in the far right column, the 138.13 there is my frequency. It's rounded, so that's why it looks a little different. An octave below is half, then half, then half, then half. And that goes all the way down to octave 4 from octave 0. You can see that there. They're just halves. Now, those will all bring me to zero stress. They're just resonating in different body systems. So if I wanted to stimulate more of the fluids and lymph flow in my body, then I would use that octave 2 there. 20 to 40 hertz is where fluids are conducting most optimally. Bone conduction would be more at octave 1. 40 to 80 hertz. Now a harmonic will still do that too. If I needed someone in a certain frequency range and their zero stress frequency with their octaves above and below didn't put them there, I can find a harmonic third or a harmonic seventh. There's a harmonic resonance as well, and those harmonics will also bring someone to zero stress. So that's what was referred to in one of the previous slides. And now in addition to those zero stress frequencies, you have the left and right ear frequencies that you're seeing in the third and fourth rows. So for me, I'm more left hemisphere brain dominant. So the higher frequency for me is going into my left ear. Now, why is that the case? If I'm more left hemisphere dominant, I want to train up my right hemisphere to be as strong as my left. So the left side of my body, 80% of that is controlled by the right hemisphere. So if I want to stimulate my right hemisphere with a higher frequency, that higher frequency has to go into my left ear because it crosses over and hits the right hemisphere. On the flip side, because my left is already stronger, the lower frequency can go into the right ear and hit the left hemisphere because the left doesn't need any more stimulation because it's already dominant for me. So between that 69.33 and 68.79, that's the frequency you're hearing, about halfway between. And those frequencies are so close together there that you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. Now the difference between them though is about 0.54, which is the top row. The second from the left is what you're seeing there. That 0.54 is the binaural beat, which falls into, like I mentioned, the delta range, which is all physical healing, recuperation, and recovery. And everyone starts in delta 1, which is the deepest level, most vegetative state of physical healing, where we're working on a cellular level in the mitochondria inside the cells. And it's a very relaxing state for a lot of people. On that top line in the far right is just the musical notation. So the 138.139, my frequency, is a C sharp in the third octave at -6 cents. And then the last two rows are nature sounds. We offer nature sounds with biotuning to help make the track a little bit more palatable and more relaxing for people. And then some of them are slowed down so that only the subconscious mind can recognize them. So I forgot to mention that when you do get to the zero stress point, not only is that the place for all healing, but that's when the subconscious mind opens up. The 95% of our brain activity where things like traumas are stored and memories. And we want to access as much of that as possible, as much as we can bear, because there's going to be a lot of stuff stored back there, because we need to work with that fully. If we want to heal holistically and in a whole manner and address things on the level of the body with how it works as a whole, then we need to access that as well. So that opens up at that zero stress point. So when people get their tracks, I encourage them to listen to them when they're getting things like acupuncture and massage done. Because when you get to zero stress and the subconscious mind is open, that's program mode for the subconscious. We can program it in a good way. And essentially, if you're getting a therapeutic session, massage, acupuncture, psychotherapy, if you're listening to your track at the same time, then you're now absorbing more out of those sessions. It's like taking a digestive enzyme for your massage or acupuncture or physiotherapy session. You're getting your money's worth and you're getting more of that locked into your body, those adjustments that are being made. Especially if we're listening to something like theta for emotional healing. You can play that in the background if you have a psychotherapy session so that you can actually access more of the emotional healing capacities that you do have when you're being worked with in that professional setting. So there has been research done for biotuning already related to stress, anxiety, depression, showing positive markers in that regard. Biotuning offers a lot more than that, but that's just a foot in the door for us in our research. Now these are the references for the presentation, so you can feel free to check them out on your own. If you want to find out more, my website is vibrationalinstinct.com. I'm located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. I need the first biotuning session done in person. After that, I can send people the rest of their tracks for 30 minutes each, and I muscle test people for their brain dominance as well as how long a track is. But if people aren't able to come back for their following sessions after Delta 1, where I do the intake, find their zero stress frequency, and do the Delta 1 track, I can just send them the rest of their tracks wherever they are in their world for a fraction of the price, and it's more convenient for them. So I wanted to mention one more thing. I believe I alluded to it earlier in the presentation, but it's really important, so I wanted to reiterate it. Every single biotuning session that you do, whether it's in person or it's provided at a distance, meaning that the track is sent to you, you keep that. So every single one of those is something that you have access to for the rest of your life. Ideally, you would have 5, 6, or even 7 sessions so that you can play with those and adapt them to your lifestyle, your process, and your healing journey, however, wherever, and whenever you want, with healing, meditation, and everyday functions, but they never expire. So it's like paying for a massage for your brain in this case, and you can have unlimited massages after purchasing the session or the track. And so really from there, there's no excuse not to listen because you have purchased this resource, and it will bring you to zero stress perpetually into the future, barring any kind of a healing crisis. So just to add to the novelty that's already there, every single track that you get, whether it's in person or received at a distance, it's yours forever. In addition to that, for every person that you refer that comes to see me and completes the initial session, I offer $20 off any of your following sessions. I also offer free 30-minute stress monitoring. So if that's something that you're interested in, it's a free session, one session available to anyone where I literally have you come in. I hook you up with the heart rate variability monitoring equipment, and I let you lay on the table for about 10 minutes, and I record your stress response. All that information stays with me, and there's no input through the headphones or table. I'm just monitoring how your stress response is at rest, so that when you have that information, you're now more empowered with a greater awareness about your body, and then what you might need to do to optimize the functioning of it and support your healing to the best of your abilities. So if you'd like to learn more, feel free to reach out to me directly through my website. I also have an email you can contact, jvictor@vibrationalinstinct.com, and I'd love to hear more from you. Thanks for your time.